electric vehicle strategy, a strategy endorsed by ministers at COTED in 2023. Since its adoption, and through both the NDC Tech Program and member states' national efforts, the region has made meaningful progress. However, as global immobility accelerates and climate pressures increase, the urgency to refine and strengthen our strategy has grown. Critical gaps remain, including the absence of regional EV charging standards, interoperability issues, end-of-life vehicle management, and safeguards to prevent technology dumping. Addressing these challenges is essential to ensure a resilient, future-ready transition. Earlier webinars in this series explored end-of-life EV and renewable energy system e-waste management, as well as incentive mechanisms for electric mobility. Today's session is timely, offering a platform to begin shaping the conversation on standardization and interoperability of EV charging infrastructure in areas that will play a central role in the revised REVs. As we conclude this year's webinar series, we look forward to an engaging discussion that will meaningfully contribute to the next phase of the REVs, the Regional Electric Vehicle Strategy. Today we have with us Xavier Gordon from Flash Motors, and he will make a presentation, as well as we have the moderator, Brian Constantine. So I will now hand over the floor to Brian. Brian?
Pleasant good morning, Ms. Britton again, and thank you for that introduction. Hello, everyone. And welcome to today's session. My name is Brian Constantine, Project Officer for Energy at the CARICOM Secretariat. So today we will be diving into a very critical conversation, standardization and interoperability powering the Caribbean's EV future. As we may be aware, electric vehicles are gaining momentum globally. However, our region faces unique opportunities and challenges, given our diverse energy infrastructures, the regulatory frameworks, and the market conditions. Now, the successful adoption of electric vehicles hinges on one common factor, which is how can these systems work together to ensure that we have harmonized standards and systems that are interoperable. So if our presenter for today's session is none other than Mr. Xavier Gordon, who is the president of Flash Motors, which is Jamaica's and the Caribbean's leading EV mobility solutions company. Under his leadership, Flash Motors offers a wide spectrum of EV-related services, from electric vehicles and charging infrastructure to fleet electrification, consulting, and financing. Prior to establishing Flash Motors, Gordon built his career in engineering and in the clean energy sector, working at General Electric in roles focused on AC and DC motors, wind turbines, and he has honed his skills both in technical and project management. Later, he founded Exergy Energy in Ontario, Canada, where he led solar PV installations and utility partnerships, including the development of public and private EV charging networks. He has a strong passion for sustainable transport, and Xavier and his team have since engaged government, utilities, and private fleets across the region to design, deploy, and scale electric mobility infrastructure. In addition to his role at Flash Motors, Xavier has served in leadership positions in clean energy sector and remains active in industry associations. I must say it's an honor to have Xavier join us to share his insights on the topic of standardization and interoperability powering the Caribbean's EV future. Before we begin our webinar, I would just like to go over a few ground rules to ensure that we have a wonderful experience for our persons that are joining the webinar. We ask that you kindly keep your microphones muted unless you're invited to speak. What this does is it helps minimize the noise that is in the background and keeps the focus on the presenter and his presentation. We're kindly asking that you utilize the chat box to share whatever insights or questions that you may have, and we will facilitate a dedicated question and answer segment after his presentation, which should last about 45 minutes. So we'll have a dedicated session for you to share your thoughts or any questions that may come to you during the presentation. And A recording of the session will also be done by the secretariat, and we're kindly requesting that if you would like a copy of the presentation, that you can kindly send an email to our program manager, Ms. Sandra Bitten. And if you experience any technical issues during the presentation, we kindly ask that you notify us so that we can seek to have that addressed as quickly as possible. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Xavier Gordon as he takes us through his presentation on standardization and interoperability powering the Caribbean's EV future. Over to you, Mr. Gordon.
Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate the opportunity to work with CARICOM once again on electric mobility. Thank you as well, Sandra, for the quick introduction. So what I'll do, I'll just dive straight into it. Let me share my screen here. Everybody okay in turn of seeing the screen? Brian, are you able to see?
Yes, Xavier, that is perfect. Please proceed.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right, so just quickly, I will go over who Flash Motors is. We're the premier electromobility solutions company in the region. We have products and projects in over 10 CARICOM nations, ranging from commercial and retail EV supplies. So commercial EVs, retail EVs for regular consumers. We do public and private charging infrastructure, as well as having our own charge management system called Flash Charge. We are headquartered in Kingston, Jamaica. So, I believe that the Caribbean is at an inflection point for electric mobility all across the region in different markets. While at different rates, still significant rates, we're seeing EV adoption rise significantly in some places. We have market leaders like Barbados that has been undergoing a transition for over 10 years, leading in terms of penetration of EVs. You have fast risers like the Bahamas, which didn't start quite as early as Barbados, but quickly might actually be on a per capita basis just as rich in electric mobility as Barbados. And then we have some fast risers like Jamaica and Guyana that, while on a per capita basis, aren't necessarily as big as those markets, but being very big markets in terms of their economic growth and size and potential, are quickly starting to move. In a lot of these places, we do see infrastructure lagging, not all. Jamaica does stand out as one of the places, and Barbados as one of the two places that actually have quite a bit of public charging infrastructure. That being said, we're still seeing the infrastructure lagging even in the big markets that do have, of note, I'll say Jamaica, while we do have quite a bit of charging stations, I still do hear quite a bit of complaints from the general public in terms of now starting to encounter things like waiting times at popular charging stations. So the adoption is rising faster than infrastructure is being put in the ground. Some markets, which are smaller islands where persons may charge primarily at home and don't really have very long distance, there might not be that much of an infrastructure gap, but we'll get into why infrastructure is important, regardless of whether people have home charging or not a little bit later on. One thing that is pretty common and that standards are undefined, whether it's importation standards, whether it's battery health standards for used EVs, whether it's charging standards and plug standards, when you have markets that can bring in any vehicle from around the world, we do not really have a lot of standardization around that. And we also don't have a lot of standardization around the installation and maintenance of charging infrastructure. So both on the vehicle and infrastructure side, most markets have yet to actually define what their standard is. And I think given the fact that we are rising in our adoption rate, it's going to be important for us to choose our trajectory right now. And I think there's a very unique proposition for us as a regional market. While we are individual nations, I think there's a lot of things we can learn from each other and move together as a regional market that will help electric mobility start to take off even further. This talk, it matters because we're just seeing so many people doing their own importation of EVs in addition to buying from local dealers. We're just not sure how the policy and infrastructure is going to keep up with that, and it's going to start to create a fragmentation. And we think that CARICOM has a really good opportunity to set the blueprint of what standards look like in a variety of fields when it comes to electric mobility. So without standards, what are we really going to experience? Again, I'm going to speak a lot to the Jamaican experience because, it's a native home market for us, and we see a lot of problems starting to creep up. We're starting to see an unreliable charging experience. People are either buying from dealers who aren't quite sure of the standard, or they're bringing in cars and they themselves aren't sure of the charging standard, and they're showing up at public charging stations not able to charge. I think just as recently in this week, I saw in one of our, EV Jamaica groups, someone had self-imported a EV, wasn't aware of the charging standard they had, and almost ran out of charge on the road. So, in addition to some education pieces of helping people understand charging standards, it's creating quite an unreliable charging experience, which I think doesn't benefit electric mobility. It's also going to integrate, sort of lead towards higher integration costs in the future. There's also, an unspoken situation of unsafe imports and customer experience. When used cars are typically brought into markets, I know I can speak for at least for Jamaica, there's a pre-inspection process that happens at certain ports for Jamaica when it comes to used cars. And a lot of that sort of gets sidelined when it comes to EVs, especially things like battery health. And so, we definitely need to have a better understanding of what's coming in so that we can enhance the customer experience. And all of this sort of leads towards inefficiencies, and I think takes away from all the advantages that come along with electric mobility, causing a lot of customer confusion, and in extreme cases could cause unsafe situations, which again would set back the cause when it comes to electric mobility. So standardization in itself, like with any industry, is important for creating a uniform experience, both for regulators, for government, for the industry that's supplying the market, and then the market as well. So, we're still early globally in terms of our adoption of electric mobility, but because the value proposition with electric mobility is so strong with the Caribbean nations, one of the things that we have the opportunity to do is to leapfrog some of these early mistakes and really and truly build a harmonized regional EV ecosystem, not necessarily from day one, but if we're going to count today as day one, then yes, we'd be building it now. And that opportunity allows us all to draw from each other's experiences and create something that's uniform, and sort of a tool or a set of tools that we can use to create that harmonized system that would really standardize customer experience, infrastructure experience, supplier experience. So we sort of look at four pillars of a unified EV region. It's, standardizing hardware, so your AC and your DC standard, standardizing software frameworks, standardizing your safety and installation protocols, and also standardizing, EV market intelligence and the framework and what that happens. Because one thing that's often missed when it comes to standardization is data collection and understanding the impact of what that looks like. So it's something that I don't think many markets typically have right now in terms of understanding their EV market. And I think even understanding what that template and what that set of information looks like will go a long way in helping regulators understand what's happening in their market, governments understanding how they can adjust fiscal policy to promote electric mobility. Suppliers like myself, understanding the data that's coming into the market allows us to adjust what we're bringing into the market, and as well as giving customers the information they need to make an informed decision. So data is often something that's overlooked, apart from sort of the hard sciences around safety and software and hardware, but data is also the thing that pulls all of that together and allows us to make decisions if things do change, as they always do in industries, allows us to make an informed decision as well. So again, we just look at it as a foundation of, affordability, keeping uptime both in vehicles and infrastructure, safety, which again is, I think, probably the biggest priority. And some of the things that, keep me up at night is understanding that are we actually being safe without standardization? And then, the latest example, again, I'm going to go to the Jamaican experience, is understanding resilience. We just went through a horrific climate event, and understanding how we can build back and build back smarter when it comes to electric mobility so that we can be resilient is also going to be extremely important. And again, data flows back into a lot of that resiliency piece as well. So let's talk about policy and market intelligence. You know, right now, a lot of the countries have just been letting car dealers do it. And I think that's unfair to car dealers who are bringing in new EVs or EVs from new brands. It's not really their area of expertise. And I think that has led to a lot of fragmentation within the markets. And what we need to be able to do as whether it's policymakers or, you know, engineers or people that are involved in different forms of government and regulation is to be able to help them make the right decisions. Utilities are also sort of, you know, expected to be able to take that. But again, and depending on the country market, utilities aren't necessarily in a position to be able to lead things like standardization. They have to follow standardization. And with a lot of utilities nowadays investing in public infrastructure, that's happened in Jamaica. We've seen that happen in Guyana. We've seen that happen in St. Lucia. It's going to be important to make sure, Belize as well too. It's going to be important to make sure that they're getting all the information and guidance that they need to understand the other sides of business and the other side of the industry that they aren't involved with. Consistency. And I think consumers getting the consistency in their EV experience is going to be key towards driving adoptability. Um, One of the things that has led EV adoption so far have been sort of the risk takers and the first movers and you know the technocrats and the people that are super interested in new technology. Those have been driving the initial adoption of EVs. But if electric mobility is really going to take off, it has to be the general consumer. It has to be the person that doesn't have time to sit and read 20 different articles and you know stay up late at night watching YouTube to find out the latest and greatest in electric mobility. It has to be the general consumer, and the general consumer is not going to look at electric mobility as a viable option until there's sort of consistency and simplicity within the market so they can make that choice. And so, you know, having a consistent, clear, and simple policy is going to make it very clear to the consumer that electric mobility isn't this complicated region or complicated sort of you know area that they would have to learn a lot in order to just drive their cars. They need to see that as a simple transition, and all of these standards are going to start with you know consistent policy. So just giving some examples of some of the things that are happening. You know, right now in Jamaica, for instance, we have mixed standards from different dealers. Sometimes the same dealer is bringing in cars with different plug standards. So even as a dealer, they can't support everything that they're selling, which you know is creating very complicated import decisions. We're also seeing a rising number of individuals bringing in Chinese spec cars which have a completely different plug standard from the rest that we use in the West. We're seeing that happen in Guyana as well. And there is even the issue of legacy plug standards like Chademo, which is the Japanese plug standard. What's driving a lot of that is that, you know, the Nissan Leaf, which is, one of the oldest electric vehicle platforms, people can buy a used Nissan Leaf for very, very cheap. And so when people are just looking to get involved with electric mobility and looking for something simple and cheap to bring in, their option a lot of times will be a used Nissan Leaf, which, you know, for a number of reasons is really a legacy platform and not really conducive for the Caribbean. It's price driven. And, you know, I think it's a good thing in the sense that more and more people are able to access electric mobility through a Nissan Leaf, but the Leaf in itself has a lot of problems. One, it has a very outdated plug standard, which is Chademo, that isn't used anywhere else except for in Japan, which you know is probably the least battery electric friendly of all the major nations. So there's not a lot of options coming out of Japan for EVs in any case. And in addition to that, the Leaf battery chemistry is really not conducive to the climate in the Caribbean, which you know creates other issues in terms of even just the reliability. And again, the age of the Nissan Leaf, a lot of the Nissan Leafs that are coming into the markets, they're, you know, some of them are 10 plus years old, way past their, sort of expected life, especially for a vehicle that would have been designed back in, 2010, 15 years ago. So a lot of things are sort of happening and it's creating a fragmentation in the market between the have and the have nots in a lot of cases. And the cost of that is things like charging infrastructure. Charging operators need to put up charging stations with multiple plugs, which reduce their usability. Instead of having a charging station or a charging site that everybody can use, it's now fragmented and only certain people can use one plug and another person can use another plug. So even the throughput in a charging station drops dramatically when you have to support multiple charging stations. So what happens is that those who are investing in infrastructure aren't able to do as much because they need to service so many more customers. And the hardware gets a lot more complicated, and even down to things like stocking spare parts. When you have to stock spare parts for different plug standards, it creates a less economically efficient value proposition. So instead of investing in more chargers, they just have to spend more money on the existing chargers that they have. And that also leads to more downtime when it comes to things like maintenance and spare parts. Um, there's also an increased safety risk. A lot of that has to do with adapters. That has sort of been the answer in a lot of markets, whether people are using Chademo or they're using GBT Chinese vehicles, or they're just simply a mix of, every single global plug standard in an island. You start to create this need and over reliance on adapters. And the thing about adapters is that you don't know what you're getting. There are some very well-made, high-quality adapters out there that you could buy and import and use without much of a safety risk. But there are also some very terrible, low-quality, high-risk adapters that are available in the market. And again, pushing that to the individual consumer creates a safety risk for everybody. We've had to supply customers with adapters to be able to use different charging infrastructure. And while, us as a company, we make sure that we're selling quality products. We've seen people show up at charging stations with something that they bought off Alibaba, and this is not a knock on Alibaba. You can find very good things on Alibaba, but you can find some not very good things. And putting that to the consumer and making them bear the sort of risk or the have to do the investigation, find the proper standard, and does it meet that, and the quality of the supplier and all of that. It's really not fair, and it creates not only a very inconvenient charging experience, but it creates a potentially unsafe charging experience both for the vehicle as well as for the charging station. And that all of that creates a very difficult sort of investment cycle when it comes to people buying EVs or putting up infrastructure as well too. So it does cost us quite a bit of momentum when we're not being standardized. So again, we don't currently have data. And again, I'm going to speak to the Jamaican experience in particular because that's the market that we operate in mainly. It's very hard for us to know how many EVs came in last year. What type of EVs? How many are new? How many are used? What plug standard are they doing? What's the condition of the batteries if they're not new? What the battery chemistry is going to be like. Even that type of information is super important in being able to plan everything as a supplier, or whether you are an infrastructure supplier, whether you're the utility. Having that information is very key, and we don't necessarily have that. Plus, policymakers need to have an idea. And it's hard for us to plan without that consistent set of data as well. So, I mean, we should be tracking at least uniformly in all of our markets and probably together as a region, the total number of EVs that are coming on a year by year basis, both new and used. What type of plug types are being supplied into the market? The batteries, what type of size batteries are coming? What type of chemistry is coming in? Condition, when EVs do reach end of life, where are they going? And that battery and that battery condition are very important because as we start to build up our inventory of EVs, some are going to be just super old, right? So we talked about Nissan Leafs that are as old as 15 years old, running around in our markets. While that's great that you can have a car that's running around that's 15 years old and satisfying that the owner's needs, eventually that vehicle will be put out of service. So what are we doing with those batteries? So we should be tracking EVs to make sure we do have an idea of how many batteries are in a particular market and coming up with a plan for either upcycling, recycling, or safely disposing all of those. And battery chemistry is also going to be important because how you recycle batteries depend on the battery chemistry as well too. even things like understanding emissions avoided. If as a region we can start to understand, as individual countries, but as a region, we can start to understand what the impact of electric mobility is based on the size of the market, we can start to make, certain assertions to say, Barbados has avoided X number of, carbon-based emissions because, 15% of her fleet is all electric. And, that in itself allows investors and governments to make informed decisions. So while each individual country has not been doing a great job of tracking all of that information, I think there's also an opportunity as a region for us to come together and have a good understanding of what the impact of electric mobility has been. And that's also important when we look at the outside supply chain, when we're looking at investment for infrastructure, we're looking at investment for, new supply chains of vehicles or things like recycling. Looking at it as a region also provides us a little bit more weight when we're being considered in the global marketplace. As individual countries, we may be quite small in the global context, but together as a region, this type of information can be quite powerful in making sure the global supply chain does pay attention to what we are doing in the Caribbean. Um, like I said, we also look at things like infrastructure planning. So, both AC and DC charger demand infrastructure for utilities and the regulators that manage those utilities. Understanding how many EVs are coming in, where they're going is going to be super important for that. Even things like energy forecasting. If we're seeing a sudden uptick of, EVs in a certain area of a city or a country, it's going to be super important for the utility to know that ahead of time so they can do energy forecasting because, heaven forbid, a certain community or a certain neighborhood or a certain part of a city, transitions to primarily EV and they all come home from work and all plug in at the exact same time without any sort of charging management. That would be catastrophic for the grid. Overall, the grid loves the fact that more and more people are plugging in and, using more electrons, but understanding how they're using is going to be important for them for planning infrastructure. And as well, when from a policy perspective, understanding, how many EVs in our market allows you to make the right decision when it comes to things like incentives. Right now, we're in a position where most, if not all markets have reduced duties for EVs. Well, what is the impact of that economically? It trickles down to the individual user or the businesses that they're seeing an economic benefit to that, but how does that benefit translate to the larger economy? These type of information are really missing in terms of, oversight and planning. And so I think getting that type of intelligence is going to be super important in helping us sort of be able to put ourselves in a position to be successful. So I think there are a couple levels that we can do it. From a data perspective, I think just right at the import perspective, understanding what's coming into all of our markets, both from a vehicle and an infrastructure point of view, making sure that they're meeting all the minimum safety standards that are globally accepted. Something as simple as a national EV registration would be important. Obviously, there's a vehicle registration, but sort of understanding the EV subset of that would be important with some of the additional details that I would have just mentioned. Even having something as simple as a public dashboard. Since governments are providing these duty relief, I think they have an incentive to also report back what the impact of that should be. And then that should roll up to a CARICOM regional database where we can see where as a region, how we're being impacted, how the incentives are working, and what the impact of those incentives have been. I think it's very simple, scalable, and actionable. So from a baseline perspective, there should be a mandate on the type of AC and DC chargers. I have pretty strong opinions on what that should be. My recommendation has always been the European plug standard for it. We should also require OCPP compliance for public chargers. And we should create minimum installation standards when it comes to infrastructure as well, too. There has been calls for a regional technician certification. We've seen GIZ, we've seen CARICOM, we've seen IDB all do technician certifications. Perhaps it's time to regionalize that and create one standard so that we can all sort of have that, as well as adopt a shared EV data template, like I would have mentioned in the previous slide, so that we're all collecting the information that we need as well. When it comes to infrastructure, interoperability, and resilience, this is what the hardware landscape looks like across the globe. And I always use this example to help people understand when you travel and you go to plug in your phone or, your laptop or any appliance, what the plug looks like is different in different countries around the world. So it's the exact same thing when it comes to EV charging plugs. While, if, pumping gas in any country in the world pretty much looks exactly the same, but we're dealing with electricity. And so as a result, there are different global standards. So at the top there in the row, you'll see what are called AC standards. And at the bottom, you'll see what are called the DC standards. And quickly, AC charging is sort of your slow overnight charging that you would plug in your vehicle, go to sleep, wake up in the morning, and it will be fully charged. Or let's say you go to work, you plug it in when you arrive at work, and when you're leaving, it's fully charged. It's a slow charge. Then there's the DC charging, which is sort of your quick charge. That's designed for you to plug in your vehicle and be in and out, fully charged or 80% charged in under half an hour. So there is the Type 1 system and CCS Combo 1, which is the old North American standard. So for about 10 years or so, that was a standard used in the US, Canada, Mexico. That has now been replaced by the Tesla or NACS standard, which is an integrated AC and DC charger. So that one plug does both AC and DC charging. So that integration, that transition started last year. So that Type 1 and CCS combo Type 1 is now an old standard that's going to be phased out over the next few years. GBT, which is Chinese, they have an AC and DC plug. It's primarily just for China and Chinese cars and left-hand drive cars. To the bottom left, you have the Type 2 and CCS2 combo, which is what we call the European standard. And just to the right of that is the CHAdeMO standard, which is the Japanese standard. There's also a very little used standard off to the extreme right, which is called the CHAoji standard. But in a lot of ways, the Tesla standard probably is the gold standard because as you can see, it's the smallest plug and it handles both AC and DC charging. But it for a very long time is proprietary to Tesla. It's now being adopted by North American manufacturers being used. The GBT standard is really strictly a Chinese standard. That's a combination of the European and the CHAdeMO standard. The European standard, the Type 2, both CCS and AC Type 2, that's really the global standard. And the reason we say that it's global is any EV manufactured in the world will have the option to be manufactured in a Type 2 because it's been mandated into law in Europe. It's also the de facto standard in every single right-hand drive country in the world. So particularly for right-hand drive countries in the Caribbean, if you're looking to access the widest supply chain of vehicles, that Type 2 is the easiest bet there. So that's one of the reasons why I advocate for that. It has been sort of enacted as a de facto standard, not by policy, but just by market conditions in Barbados, in St. Lucia, in Guyana, as a de facto standard in those three markets. Jamaica, it's starting to get there because the vast majority of brand new EVs sold in Jamaica are come with that European plug. So we're starting to see the market shift towards it, but there's still quite a bit of suppliers that have the American standard and a lot of self imports that are either would be Japanese or the Chinese standard, which creates a lot of chaos at the plugs. I would have just gone over that. One of the other things about CCS2 is that, with the same plug, you can do both single and three-phase options. Three-phase being the quicker option when you're looking for a charge and cheaper option if you do have three-phase power. Not every market in the Caribbean has three-phase at home, but if you do, CCS2 makes it even easier for you. The Type 1 doesn't have three-phase options at all. OCPP, which is the language of interoperability. It enables things like remote control, smart charging, monitoring, grid management, and something which is truly unique, which is cross-operator roaming. Now, most of the markets don't have multiple major vendors when it comes to public charging. Again, Jamaica is unique in that, and we have two large ones, both JPS and Erigo, and their systems don't speak. OCPP allows you to be able to speak. Now, just based on industry knowledge, I know that both of those are built on OCP platforms. So the ability for them to be able to speak is there. It's just not necessarily something that has been done. And why interoperability and cross-operator roaming is important is that, again, it simplifies the user experience. As it is right now, most charging networks have their own integrated app, their own way of, processing payments and creating profiles. And so what's ended up happening is people are bringing multiple charge cards or having multiple apps to be able to access charging. And again, it's not too big of an issue when you're a first adopter and you're super passionate about EVs. You don't mind. And, I would say right now, most people probably in Jamaica and other places don't really mind it that much. But again, if we're going to put ourselves in a position to have electric mobility appeal to the general public, the person who doesn't have time or passion for that sort of complexity, having something or an interface where they can just simply interact with a charger, pay for it. It doesn't matter who owns it. It doesn't matter which network it's on. Simplifying that experience will go a lot way in unlocking the size of the electric mobility market. And so that cross operator roaming that OCPP allows, it's actually through OCPI, which is a subset of that, allows you to be able to do that. It also allows you to do things like report information back to the utilities. I'm not sure if all the utilities have full visibility to AC and DC charging, whether it's public and private. And that's important in the same way, a smart meter is important. That data allows utilities to be able to properly plan their infrastructure when they're making investments. Utilities think in terms of decades and understanding where power consumption, how power consumption is going to be used and consumed is going to be extremely important for them. And the OCPI allows a bridge between things like the chargers and the vehicles and the utilities so that they can make the right investments. That standardization of communication, data exchange, authentication, energy sessions will be super useful. I'll share with you a vision that we think would be really awesome is if you were actually able to integrate your public charging into your utility bills. So regardless of who owns the charging stations, where the charging station is, if that can simply appear on your Lucelect bill or on your JPS bill at the end of the month, where your electricity is just simply commoditized no matter where you are. It's not just about the meter at your home or at your workplace, but it follows you everywhere virtually. I think, again, that creates a uniform, simple experience that would drive electric mobility adoption and make things simple. We shouldn't have to make people go through an extreme learning curve in order to be able to drive an electric vehicle. It should be simple and easy and straightforward. And having that standard integrated into our infrastructure would be super important. There's also things, and I know I'm slightly behind schedule here. Microgrids and solar and storage integration. It's a perfect fit for islands. Some markets don't have as much of a problem in supplying electricity and having the capacity for public charging infrastructure. Some places may have it in a certain market, while other parts of the market may not have it. Having a microgrid and storage and that allows you to put more chargers in more places or boost the charging speed. And of course, add a very important piece, which is resilience. We just got power back to the charging stations on the western end of Jamaica this past weekend. So it's been weeks with having EV drivers on that side of the island have to deal with the hunt and find to find public charging infrastructure that works for them. And so adding this microgrid and solar and storage integration will improve that resilience. So when the next climate change event happens, because it will happen again, we're ready for that. Speaking of that, we want to talk about how we can be more resilient in our infrastructure, having elevated chargers, so making sure they're in elevated concrete pads so they're not prone to flooding, having strong enclosures, battery backends to the sites, microgrids that can be islanded, and even things like mobile DC chargers for disaster response are all things that we need to start thinking about from an infrastructure perspective to climate proof that this sector of electric mobility and transportation. Safety governance and future proofing. Again, we have mixed plugs, unknown battery chemistries, a lot of BMS, battery management system incompatibilities that are going to lead to things like high failure rates and thermal risks. I've seen adapters expand and crack under high DC charging because someone would have brought in a cheap adapter off of Amazon or Alibaba that can't really fit it. And that's a risk to us from a safety perspective and infrastructure perspective. There are global standards. We don't need to recreate the real, which is something we do quite a bit in the Caribbean on the academic side. These international standards exist as the IEC 61851 and 62196, making sure infrastructure is ULNCE certified, when it comes to infrastructure, putting in building codes. And I think a big part of that's missing, that's really easy, is having an inspection framework. So when chargers, both public and private, are put up, making sure that within the electrical code of each nation, that there is an inspection framework. Again, having been doing this for almost 8 years in the Caribbean, putting in charging infrastructure, I have seen some truly horrific installs. It's gone to the point where us as a company, we don't trust anybody else to put in electrical wiring unless it's us, because you can give people the instructions on all the wiring diagrams and they won't put the right size breaker or the right size wire. And it becomes a fire risk for a lot of people. We've seen incidents happen in Jamaica of fires happening. And so, having an inspection framework to make sure that everybody's doing things to the book is going to be extremely important. Technician training, and again, I will acknowledge that both CARICOM, GIZ, IDB have all put in quite a bit of work in making sure that training has happened, within their individual markets. I think maybe even putting together a regional standard for that would make it easier for smaller markets that may not have benefited from some of those programs to quickly adopt, what needs to happen and what's acceptable in the market. And that's both for the vehicles as well as for the infrastructure side as well, too. We talked about resilience standards as well, too, things like flood sensors, having the right enclosures, emergency shutoffs. End of the day, resilience is not just about, being able to recover, but it's also a big part of safety as well, too. And so I believe we have a window of opportunity when it comes to standardization and interoperability. The vision that I just simply have is that the region itself can work together and use the best practices from each of the markets to have something that we can all draw from. So I think we should adopt, a charging standard. We should require OCPP for public and private charging stations. We should standardize what market intelligence looks like. We should be setting minimum installation codes, continue to train technicians, and then just develop EV-ready microgrids so that we can add resilience to what we're doing right now in the market. I think it's a foundation of making EV and electric mobility affordable, safe, and a real beacon of what resilience can be with electric mobility. Thank you. Open for questions.
Thank you very much, Xavier. That was a wonderful presentation. Yes. So Xavier, you've given us a lot to think about regarding the role of standardization and operability as it relates to four elements there: affordability, time, safety, and resilience. We're very much appreciative of the clarity and depth that you would have provided in your presentation. There are a number of points that you would have raised during your presentation. You would have reinforced the notion that EV adoption is rising in the region, and we kind of have a fragmented market where we have importation of EVs are being influenced by dealers who are unaware of whatever standards exist within the country, and this leads to unreliable experience from the user perspective, and which can likely lead to the effect negatively impacting the EV adoption across the region. An important point you raised too is the need for data and the role it plays in infrastructure planning, energy forecasting, safety. And I wanted to reinforce safety because you would have pointed to the need for standards when it comes to safety. And one other point you would have raised is environmental management too. So those are some key issues that you would have raised as it relates to the need for data on EV importation within the region. And I just want to reinforce something you said is that we have an opportunity because we are early on in we're in the embryonic stage of EV adoption, and we have an opportunity now to basically set the market conditions so that we can influence what our infrastructure landscape can look like. Thank you very much for sharing the experience from the Jamaica perspective and from the Ghana perspective. That is much appreciation. That is much appreciated. Sorry. So we have time for some questions and maybe discussion. So for those who are joining us, if you have a question for our presenter, you are free to raise your hand or drop a question in the chat or mute yourself if you're joining us live. We'd very much like to hear what thoughts you may have or reflections as well. So I'll go straight to the chat. I see Mr. Howard Clash has a question. Are there any DC fast charging stations on the global market that would be able to support multiple plug types in the Caribbean? He has two questions, so I prefer that we go to questions one by one, and I can give Xavier an opportunity to address them effectively. Please proceed, Xavier.
Yeah, man. Thanks, Howard. I appreciate that. So yeah, you can definitely supply a charging station that would have 3 plugs on it. It could have CCS1, CCS2, and GBT on that. And then, people can show up and they can choose one. The problem that I have with that, and there are some great examples of that, for instance, in the Dominican Republic, again, when there is no regulation and people just bring in whatever they want. If I'm a charging station operator, and I'm going to do it from two perspectives. I'm a charging station operator. I'm going to spend a certain capex to buy and install and maintain this charger. Now, instead of having 3 plugs that people can use, I am segmenting my infrastructure into different users, because what'll happen is if you decide to start rolling out stations with multiple plugs, people aren't going to buy adapters because they're going to believe that, well, if I go to a charging station, I don't need an adapter. I can just use the one that works for me. But what happens when 2 people show up to use one particular plug? Do they now have to go buy an adapter? Now is the guy who has a CCS2 one using the GBT plug, and then when the guy shows up with the GBT plug, he can't use it because there's another guy using his. It reduces the throughput, and it creates a very economically inefficient way of serving the public. Now, you take that exact same charging station with 3 plugs, and they're all in the same standard. Now you can support 3 people anytime, anywhere, any place. You now create a uniform experience for that person. And again, if you look at it from the user perspective, I'm second guessing. Does this particular charging station have my particular plug? Do I need to buy an adapter to do it? Which adapter do I need to buy? Because now there are 3 plugs. I have one vehicle that has one type. Do I need to buy 2 sets of adapters? So now I'm putting the economic burden on the driver, not only to buy the car, but to buy 2 additional adapters so that they have maximum flexibility when they go to a charging station. There's too many decisions being made. There's no need for it. If we have one simple standard, people aren't thinking about, do I need an adapter? Which plug can I use? It's a very simple, straightforward process. I go to a charging station and I plug in my vehicle for it. So again, it's okay for early adopters who don't mind all of this, but if we're thinking about the regular person that wants a simple experience, we can't have them second guessing if they're going to go to the right charger and the right plug. We want to make that system and that entire experience as uniform as possible, to take out all of the guesswork. So that's been my position with it. In the same way, if we, didn't mandate wall plugs and you showed up to your friend's house and they had a different wall plug from what you did, now you're carrying adapters around and you're second guessing and, creating a very complicated process of plugging something into the wall. So I think it should be the same thing with EVs. We shouldn't complicate it. It should be just one simple plug standard and take the guesswork out as best as you can. It is a little complicated because we do have a global market. We don't have, for instance, vehicle import regulations in Jamaica, for instance, because you can import a car from anywhere in the world into Jamaica, whether it's right-hand drive or left-hand drive. So there will always be persons who will bring in anything into that. But in the same way, if I brought in a fridge from Japan, I would need to get an adapter to do it. I know that me taking up something that is sort of outside of the norm, outside of the standard, I would then be burdened with having to create or, find a different solution so it can fit the standard. But without a standard, we're creating so many market segmentations that it's literally turning people off from the idea of using electric vehicles, because now instead of just buying a car and driving it, I need to learn that there are 7 different plug standards, and I need to figure out which charging station has the plug standard for the car that I bought, and making sure I have the adapter for it. And if I get there and someone else is using it, what do I do? So yes, you can, but I just don't think it's the ideal situation. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
Right, okay, Xavier. We have a second question from Mr. Kalash. Has there been any consideration for CARICOM to build a microgrid off-grid pilot EV charging hub like GridServe in the UK?
Not that I'm aware of. I know that a lot of private companies and private individuals are sort of building things. I mean, a lot of our customers in Jamaica, they have home solar, and so that's sort of not a DC charging hub, it's a personal AC charging hub. And that's been a lot of the first adapters. People who have solar and storage at home see the benefit of getting an electric vehicle because they can charge off, sunshine. But on a large scale, I believe there might be some um, grid connected solar plus storage solutions in Barbados. So I think there are a couple of those. I know Bahamas has DC charging stations at their national stadium that are connected to solar, but they're also grid connected. So I don't know if there are any off-grid DC charging hubs in the Caribbean just as yet. If they are, they're private.
Okay, okay, understand. I see a follow-up question. How many charging stations should be at a site?
It depends. I think there should at least be a minimum of, 2 DC plugs and 1 AC. I think that's always should be the minimum going forward. And we've seen that again, using the Jamaica reference, both JPS and Evergo, where possible in their locations that they do put charging stations, you'll typically find that there's DC and AC charging on the same site. But it's going to be sort of it's never static as they deploy at least with JPS, this was JPS's philosophy, was to deploy a wide network first and then sort of intensify those sites as they go along. So they would have deployed an island-wide network as 3, 4 years ago, and you're starting to see the intensification where they're adding more sites or adding more chargers to the sites that they're at, and that's going to be based off of demand. Really and truly, you should always try to keep your utilization at least 50%. So, 50% of the time that you expect chargers to be used, a plug should be used. That's typically the industry standard. So it does depend, but from a minimum perspective, 2 DC and 1 AC should be sort of the minimum.
Okay, Xavier, thank you very much for that question. Is there anyone who would like to ask any follow-up or further questions? Okay, so I have a question, Xavier. How can standardization and interoperability frameworks on a regional level, right, promote the adoption of EVs and whilst balancing the varying infrastructure, regulatory environment, economic challenges within the island states in the region?
I think it stops every country from having to recreate the wheel. There are already standardization and implementation and interoperability frameworks that exist. Different islands have done the work on it already, or just globally. Those all of the thinking and sort of the capitulation of policy has already been done. I think formally, creating one that's a regional standard and encouraging each CARICOM nation to adopt that standard simply makes things easier and creates a more uniform experience. It allows everybody to play by the same rules so that we can really just focus on adoption and encouraging customers and education piece, and allows us, regardless of the island, whether it's large or big, whether they're focused in electric mobility or they're not necessarily focused. Some islands are taking a lead in it. They're putting EVs in the government fleet. I would say Bahamas is one, in particular, that in addition to having an EV policy, they're actually buying EVs and putting them in the government fleet. Um, Jamaica has a really good policy, but we haven't seen the government do much in terms of actually adopting EVs in there. So they're taking different approaches to it. One is more market driven in Jamaica, one is very government driven, which is creating a market condition in the Bahamas. But regardless of how they choose to go about it, having the exact same framework for, like I said, safety, importation, data collection, infrastructure, vehicle standards sort of makes it very uniform. And for me, even me as a supplier, it allows me to be able to treat the entire market as a region rather than dealing with, multiple markets that may have gaps. Safety probably should be the part that leads everything. I'm always say that, we're one major incident away from setting back electric mobility 5 years. People are already skeptical, as they should be, about electricity. We were taught as children to be wary of electricity and to be safe around it. And so by extension, people are wary of electric vehicles. I've had people come up to me and ask me if I can charge my electric vehicle when it's raining. That's fair because we're taught that water and electricity don't mix. So, I think that's something that can happen. Even regional education initiatives could be done. And I think CARICOM is probably the one of the best platforms to do that on.
Thank you very much, Xavier. I see Mr. Shahad Hussein has his hand raised. Shahad, you can unmute your mic and kindly proceed with your question. Okay, Mr. Hussein, you're free to proceed with your question. Kindly unmute your microphone.
Hello?
Yes, Mr. Hussein, please proceed. We can hear you.
Hi, thanks, Mr. Brian. Thanks, presenter, for those informations. Question: I know you mentioned about infrastructures regarding to charging and microgrid, those kind of stuff. I was just curious to know about electric workshops, the structure in those charging areas as well. What would be your take on it?
Sorry, it broke up a little bit. Electric what?
No, the electric infrastructure, right? Porting into workshops, vehicle workshops, those charging as well as to maybe repair, maintenance, training, the whole general concept in infrastructure.
Yeah, so I mean, infrastructure I think is going to be important. I mean, it can be simple, but I think experience counts. So, if you're looking at an AC charger, it's the same process like installing a dryer. It's double pole, 230, 220, 240 volt, sort of, power requirement and a 40 amp breaker. Typically at home, that's sort of what you're looking at. You obviously want to have a good understanding of where you're placing chargers physically so they're in a good, safe location. DC charging a little bit more complicated. I think the skill set that people have with solar, so you'll find a lot of solar installers quite do make the leap into, EV infrastructure because now they're dealing with DC and they have a better understanding of DC. Most solar people have an understanding. So the skill set I think is already there. The training and sort of the upskilling, it could be as simple as a 2-day course to get a lot of people familiar and comfortable with charging infrastructure if they have the necessary electrical, and I said especially solar electrical experience. Where I think we're really missing a lot of help and from a safety perspective in most of our markets is post inspection of installs. And I think that's in general. That's not just specific to EVs, but I just believe that creates a risk within the EV industry if there aren't post-installation inspections and certifications to make sure that something was installed the way it should be. And, again, I'm speaking from experience. I've dealt with certified, well-experienced electricians who just did not follow the installation standard properly and created safety risks. So I think from a government perspective and from an industry perspective, there is a need to make sure, because again, we are a new industry. It is something that could potentially create a safety issue, and we just want to, cross our T's and dot our I's to make sure that things are being installed properly.
Thank you very much, Xavier. Mr. Hussein, is there a follow-up to that? I see your hand is still raised. Okay, thank you, Mr. Hussein. I have a question coming from YouTube. Um, y- and they're asking what formal training will be available to install and maintain these systems and vehicle. I believe they're talking about the charging infrastructure when they refer to systems.
Yeah, it depends on the market. I mean, private, dealer groups are doing their stuff. So when they're selling, some dealer groups are making sure that people, reputable people are installing. Some aren't. A lot of people are importing themselves. I don't know what happens when someone imports a vehicle from Japan or from China, how they're making sure that they're getting the right infrastructure in. If they're buying it off Amazon or Alibaba, we don't know. We don't have that information. And so there isn't anything uniform in any of the markets that addresses that. And that's where, my hope is that CARICOM or, some other regional entity or government entity can step in and sort of push for that to actually happen.
Okay, thank you very much, Zephyr. So I have another question on standardization and how do we really strike that balance between encouraging persons to increase adoption and and enforcing standardization to avoid fragmentation? Because persons would want to be on the economic side of bringing an EV from maybe the Chinese or the Asian market, and how do we not influence that adoption that is ongoing?
It's an imperfect science. Standardization always comes at a cost. And you have to look at the other side. What is the cost of something going wrong? And is it worth it? Is that worth it? And maybe that comes down to the individual person's decision. Again, China is a market, it's by far the largest market in the world. I think they sell 20 million new cars a year. That's more than people, in the Caribbean, or almost as much as people in the Caribbean. So, that market scale means that vehicles are cheaper if you source them from the actual retail market in China. And so there's a very strong economic incentive to say, I can buy, this car brand new from a dealer in the Caribbean for 30,000, but I can buy the Chinese version of that car from China for 20,000. So you save $10,000. So right then and there, it seems like a pretty, safe economic decision. But if you're buying something used, you don't know the condition of the battery. You don't know, for instance, if it's been in an accident. You don't have that. We don't necessarily have those mechanisms in place right now for EVs to be able to say, hey, have we done the checks, especially when it comes to the battery? And then again, you get the plug that isn't compatible with anything over here. You have to buy an adapter. I know the GBT adapters, they're upwards of $500, and they're not reliable. You usually have to change them every year or two. If you do have an incident where, let's say, someone rear ends you in your quarter panel where your charging plug is, maybe one plug is out, you don't have your AC charger now, you have to DC charge. It starts to become this game of inefficiency. And I use an example in my presentation. There's some really nice appliances that you can buy from Japan, but if you import them from Japan, they're not going to work off the bat on our grid in the Caribbean. You're going to have to make some sort of modifications to your home's electrical system to be able to integrate that. And so based off of that alone, is it worth the cost? Would you get warranty? Will you get support? So there is an economic decision to be made towards it. Certainly, I wouldn't be advocating to restrict people from doing things, but I think at least having a standard and an expectation to say, this is the standard, this is expectation. If there's anything that you're doing outside of that, it can influence people towards standardizing it, so that, people can make a much more informed decision. When there is no standard, then there really isn't anything holding you back from doing whatever it is that you want. Standardization creates an expectation around what you deem to be acceptable. It may even affect things like bank financing and insurance, because again, as an insurer, you may want to insure or have a more affordable option for people that are following a standard that can be supported locally. So that those are the sort of things that need to sort of happen. It's impractical to support everything in the world, and that's one of the things that I think has sort of been pushing it. There's nowhere in the world that just that has organization around themselves that actually will just say you can do anything. In Europe, Even Tesla can't use the Tesla standard. They have to use the European standard. So Tesla modified and made sure so that anywhere you go in the UK or continental Europe, you have the exact same plug, and it's created a uniform experience for everybody. China, they only use the GBT standard. They don't use the Tesla standard. Same thing. Tesla doesn't make their cars in China with their own standard. They make it with the GBT standard because they're responding to the market, and it creates a uniform experience for everybody there. Australia, same thing. South America, same thing. UK, same thing. There is a uniform thing. North America is doing a transition from an old one to a new one, but as it goes along, every new car you buy in North America, starting, I mean, as early as this year, has just been available in that North American / Tesla standard. So I think standardization needs to lead the way, and if people choose to do something else, they can, but there has to be sort of like a cost benefit analysis to not be in standard that individuals will have to make, but a government at the very least should lead the way in saying this is what our expectation is.
Yes, thank you very much for that, Xavier, and that is and that wraps up our question and answer segment. I just want to say thank you again for your wonderful and insightful presentation. You've basically given us a lot to think about with regards to the role of standardization and interoperability, and importantly, how it affects affordability, time, safety, and resilience. We very much appreciate the clarity and depth that you've included or you brought within our presentation and the discussions that we would have had. I will now like to thank our attendees for joining us and for your active participation in discussion. I will now like to hand over to Ms. Sandra Britton, who will give our closing remarks.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Xavier, for that presentation. It's a lot we have to think about as we revise our revs, and interoperability will be a big component of it as we do the revision. So thanks once again. As we bring this year's webinar series to a close, we reflect on the depth and diversity of the discussions that have unfolded over the past week, spanning from e-mobility. We had webinars on geothermal development and the broader principles that underpin a just and equitable energy transition in the Caribbean. Each session has reinforced a simple truth. Our region stands at an important turning point where ambition, innovation, and collaboration must converge to accelerate a cleaner and more resilient energy future. From advancing electric mobility and building the systems that support it, to understanding geothermal energy, its benefits, challenges, and risks, to ensuring that our community is not left behind in this transition, these conversations have provided insights, inspiration, and a shared sense of purpose. They remind us that the path forward requires both technical excellence and people-oriented approaches, both regional coordination and national leadership. So on behalf of the CARICOM Secretariat and our partners, we extend sincere thanks to all our presenters, participants, and stakeholders who contributed to this series. Your expertise, your questions, and your encouragement have enriched the dialogue and strengthened the collective effort to shape a sustainable energy landscape for our region. As we lower the curtains on this year's series, we do so with optimism, knowing that the ideas exchanged here will continue to guide policy, inform actions, and inspire progress long after today. We look forward to continuing this journey with you as we drive forward the Caribbean and Caribbean's clean energy transition. Thank you again, and thank you, Xavier, for this presentation, and thank you again, all presenters and sponsors. Special mention to the GIZ team, and we do thank you for the participants, and do have a great remainder of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.